Today I have David Morse here to talk about petroglyphs, and he's an artist, but also he has incorporated this wonderful art form right into his art. And so first we're going to start off. The first part of our conversation will be about the petroglyphs themselves, and then we'll move into talking about his personal art. Hi, Dave. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. Good to see you.
Great. So give us just a quick description of what are these forms?
Petroglyphs, we believe, a type of prehistoric information system. And a lot of times you'll hear petroglyphs referred to as rock art. And there's no doubt that there is beauty there. But we think they were a little more significant than just to carve a nice looking picture into a stone. And of course, petroglyph, petro is rock, and glyph is carving. And so that's what we're looking at here, mostly in this part of the Southwest, are rock carvings done into our granite and basalt stones that are here. We also have pictographs in Arizona, which is a type of rock art, but done with pigments. And then we have earth forms, or geoglyphs they're called sometimes, which are pretty massive ground figures that were made by placing stones or arranging the desert varnish gravel we see here in the Southwest. But for the most part, been really enamored with the petroglyphs left behind by the ancient people.
How would you compare these forms to things that we see around the world in other countries?
Very similar. And of course, we do see rock carvings. Here in Arizona, we have the Hieroglyphic Springs Trail, which is a big concentration of petroglyphs. And hieroglyphic is its name, although that might be a little bit of a misnomer. Hiero means sacred, and glyph is carving. So the sacred carvings, hieroglyphs, are usually kind of limited to the priestly languages of like the Egyptian or Mayan or Aztec types of glyphs that seem to have actually more of an alphabet that you can read. Our petroglyphs are more like a bulletin board information, symbols that just give you a clue as to things like maybe where water can be found, or denoting or remembering a story, things along those lines.
Lizard people, where am I getting that from?
That's a secondhand story that I got many years ago. There's a symbol here of a lizard figure, and a lot of them will show a round tummy done on this stick figure type of a lizard symbol. The archaeologists call it the Gila bulge. Naturalists believe it may be depicting a Choctaw lizard that lives here in our desert. And it's a pretty good sized lizard. It's, can be 12 inches long, but it has a lot of loose skin around its middle. And when it gets scared, it runs into a rock crevice and inflates that loose skin like a balloon. And then he's wedged into that crevice, and it's just almost impossible to remove him. So that's his defense system. So that little round bulge that we see, they think is depicting that Choctaw.
Oh.
But the native story I got was that was depicting a group of people called the lizard people. And so when the ancients first came to this area, they didn't know how to live in this hot, arid environment. So the lizard people came up out of the sand world to teach them how to live in this arid environment. When they came up into this world, their tails fell off. And so they did their job and educated our native people here. And then they went back down into their sand world. And once back, they grew their tails back again. So that little bulge we see around the middle of our lizard men are actually the hole that they came up into this world through, and not actually depicting a stomach or anything like that. And in most of the symbols that you see then, with that kind of a central bulge or entrance into this world, you can see that the lizard man is halfway in our world. He's kind of up there with his, what we call the appeasement pose. And he's halfway still in his world because he still has his tail on.
Very local, or would it have been something that somebody migrating or moving through would have gotten a sense of the images?
Again, the images do vary quite a bit. We do see a lot of animal figures. So lizards and snakes and turtles, bighorn sheep, antelope, things like that are somewhat ubiquitous throughout the petroglyphs here. But there are some symbols that we see only here in the Southwest. Just to bring up one example is our little Kokopelli figure, which is a hunchback flute player. We believe an ancient trader bringing the new seeds of corn, beans, and squash into this area of the Southwest. And so he's depicted kind of hunched over because he's probably carrying a backpack full of these seeds and trade goods, and then maybe playing the flute to let everybody knows here comes Kokopelli, kind of like the ice cream man rings his bell to let you know here come all the goodies.
Yeah.
But we don't see Kokopellis in other parts of America. Seems to be pretty much isolated here.
And is there a trickster kind of connotation?
The other story is, and it's a little rascally, but they say that actually Kokopelli comes to the different villages, maybe with the trade goods, but then instead of giving the seeds out to the village, he gives his seed out to the maidens of the village. And so whether you think of him as a prehistoric Johnny Appleseed or the first traveling salesman.
We're so removed from our agrarian roots in terms of our food supply and stuff. And one of the things I read talking about petroglyphs is it's really almost a disservice to call it art, that it's much more pragmatic in its ability to help navigate people towards food and so on. What's the consensus on that?
Kind of the way the pendulum seems to be swinging. I would say that when I first came here, although the Choctaw people, my tribe, had petroglyphs as well, but not the amazing variety we see here in the Southwest. But I was really enamored with the beauty of the rock art to begin with. But as I investigated more and as more Native people become involved in interpreting the petroglyphs, we now beginning to understand that it was much more than just the beauty of the design, but it was a very functional design. Again, spirals tell you where to find water, but that's a pretty intricate design to carve into a stone. Long lines of figures often mean to follow this trail or go this direction. So yeah, they did have a purpose, and not just a graffiti that some people did as they went passing by and stuff. So rock art's still heard commonly, but we do believe it's much more advanced than just a rock. Now, maybe I should also say that to a Native American mind, difference between arts and crafts is very thin. Just because an object or a picture is functional doesn't mean it shouldn't also be beautiful to look at. So we often don't make those distinctions.
As we live in a world of digital images, I think we're going to see a renaissance of craft in a way that we've never experienced, when something you can hold in your hand and you can see process. At one time, it was kind of like, that's considered crafty. That will someday be a compliment.
I agree.
So how do they date these carvings?
A couple of different ways, especially when we're just concerned with the petroglyphs. The carvings are done on granite or basalt surfaces here, which develop patina, which is called a rock varnish. So it's a real dark coloring because of all the iron and manganese we have in the rock system here. And so by removing that, and of course petroglyphs are what they call a subtraction art form. We're actually removing part of the rock surface, as opposed to pictographs, which we apply a paint. So that's an addition of the image. We can do it by roughly how darkened the figure has become, because it's a natural process. It's patination. And so the rock art becomes older, the desert varnish recurs again. And so it makes the design much darker. So a lightly colored petroglyph symbol probably is young, just speaking young, geologically young, and a darker figure probably is older because it's had that time to repatinate. Now, the other thing they'll use is design. So, for example, we see figures with bows and arrows carved into the stone, but bows and arrows weren't used here in the Southwest till about 500 AD. So then we know that art form or that figure was after that period. we see some examples even here in this area of cattle being carved into the stone. And of course, we know cattle weren't here until the 1500s when the Spanish introduced them. So by kind of juggling those two things, we can kind of get an idea of about the time period that they were carved.
Interesting. Cacti are untouchable. You're not supposed to take those down. What are some myths or tribal legends that deal with the landscape?
Sure. Well, saguaro is a good example. Now, again, historically speaking, saguaros weren't here in the Sonoran Desert till about 8,000 years ago. That was kind of like the last little mini ice age we had here. But we know that people have been here well over 10,000 years ago. So we do see a lot of traditional stories about the origin of the saguaro. Some people believe that their ancestors come back as saguaros, and for that reason, saguaros are revered and not damaged or things like that. And of course, saguaros play a part in our Southwestern culture as a rain asking ceremony where they actually make a wine from the saguaro fruit during just before our monsoons usually, and that's hopefully will bring the summer rains that we need here. So yeah, there's some petroglyphs we think are maps of areas. Some may actually show skylines of rock mountain ridges as a directional symbol or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there is a close tie to the environment here for the use of the rock art too.
It feels like sometimes we miss such a big section of history when we're talking about these things and where we're at today. Can you kind of fill us in a little bit?
Pre-Columbian, before Columbus got here, there were well over 60 million Native Americans living here in the 48 states. And today we have about 9.5 million Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So this big influx of other cultures really did a number on the Native American population here. Luckily for us here in Arizona, and like for my tribe, the Choctaws, we were moved from our Mississippi homeland in the 1830s. And we say the government invited us to move to Oklahoma. And so that's where we are now. And we're doing good, I have to say. We're probably about the 5th or 6th largest Native tribe in America. But for our Native people here in the Southwest, for the most part, they're still on their ancestral home grounds. And so that makes a strong bond with their environment and their traditions that they still observe here. Again, a big Spanish influence here was one of the main factors for the change in our people. Spanish name for the Acamel people that live here along the Gila and Salt Rivers was Pima, the Pima people, which some people may be familiar with. But that was the Spanish name that was given to them when the Spanish introduced themselves to the Native Americans and said, well, who are you? What people are you? Of course, the Indians didn't speak Spanish. They had their own native language. And so every time the Spanish would talk to them, they would say a phrase such as Pimash, Pimash. I don't understand what you're saying. And so in recorded, they became the Pima people to the Spanish. So their traditional name actually is Acamel Oatham, which is river people.
You were talking a little bit about the water source there, and can you talk a little bit about that and why there's a proliferation of designs in that area?
When we look at that possible misnaming hieroglyphic springs or canyon, we believe that some of the petroglyphs are spiritual in nature, or for the most part are spiritual in nature. So the hieroglyphic, sacred carving term may not be far off the bat, actually. Water in the desert, boy, that means life. If you want to have good crops and fertility in the village system, you're going to have a water source. So that particular site in the Superstition Mountains has tanks, huge rock tanks, which I have never been there, even in the middle of summer where there wasn't some water available. So first of all, of course, this is going to be a hunting area because animals need the water to keep going. And so that's why we'll see a lot of the bighorn and deer symbols which may not actually be saying we saw a deer or a bighorn, but may be saying we want to see a bighorn so we have a successful hunt. And so some people call that imaging, or in the old days, sympathetic magic. I think is when you draw it first, and then that's going to make it happen. I tried that on my last tax return. No magic there, no sympathy either. But here's symbols asking the creator maybe for things like rain, because there are several big spiral symbols on that particular site that I mentioned, asking for the rains to come. We have rainbow figures that are just kind of a stick figure, basically, again, mostly in what we call the appeasement pose, that have a arc over their head, which you believe is symbolizing the rain has come. So that's a thank you to the creator for bringing the rain they needed for their crop systems and things like that. We'll see cloud symbols with rains coming down out of that. So all this is tied in with the tradition of the people here, which is still very strong in our native cultures, or again, because of the tie to the land they have.
I'd read that it was considered kind of a safety zone for the tribes to meet because of the water, and they would talk.
Sure. Our native population here never had much altercations with their neighbors. There's a saying, which seems a little incongruent, but it says basically there are no islands in the desert. And so everybody's got to work together to make sure that the people survive and traditions are carried on. So yeah, they were kind of a safe place, a spiritual place, because in many cases we believe that either only the shaman or maybe somebody with the artistic ability actually did the carvings of the petroglyphs. And so that would speak to the spirituality of the site as well. Yeah, it is a beautiful site and very spiritual as well. One of the first ethnographic people that came out here thought that she would do them a great favor by bringing them a carload of food, canned meats and things like that, to see them through the rough, hot summer here. And when she gave them, Ruth Underhill was this author's name, they immediately sent runners out to all parts of the village and surrounding area, and everybody came in and feasted, because you're going to share with everybody when it's possible. And because if you don't, when your hard times come, you might not have anybody coming to your rescue.
That's beautiful. Wow. Tadpole picture I took. Can you talk about that?
And it's no mistaking it. It is obviously a tadpole, although it looks kind of like it depicts a fertility symbol as well. And both those things go hand in hand, actually. If you're going to have a fertile crop or a village system, you're going to have that water. So above these tanks, water catchments that we see in the mountains, we often see tadpole symbols carved into the rock. And it's very visible. So again, here's, you're topping the ridge that overlooks these petroglyphs. You see that symbol and you're thinking, well, maybe there's a water source nearby. And in fact, in this case, there is. Our canyon tree frog, which is our Arizona state amphibian, breeds in those ponds. So they would have seen those little creatures in there. But I think it's kind of interesting that today, that little, it's a little like a circle with a little squiggly tail. That's the tadpole symbol. Is the same symbol they use on the modern topographic maps to illustrate seeps or springs that are in the area here. So that design actually is kind of carried over.
Aztec rain god.
Tlaloc is a Mesoamerican rain god. And again, pointing to the fact that these people weren't isolated. They had contact with Mesoamerica and the other people here in the Southwest. So it wasn't an isolated situation for them. As these cultures combined and different ideas came to be co-opted into their traditions, we see figures. Tlaloc is a geometrical design. In Mesoamerica, he's kind of more of a square figure with a lot of geometrical stair steps and things like that in his body. Our version of what we suppose is Tlaloc is much more elongated, but still very geometric. The archaeologists call it a pipette symbol. It looks like the pipettes with the little protuberances along the side. But the hallmark of Talalak is big Google eyes that are looking at you. And so in our symbols here, you're going to see those big Google eyes peering out of Talalak. So we kind of make the assumption that that is our version of that Mesoamerican rain god.
When you look at it, the sections, how do you describe that?
When other people have spoken about that symbol, they believe, although it is a rain symbol, they think it's actually showing first world, second world, third world. Because like a lot of Native American beliefs, we believe there are different worlds that we have emerged from. And so that's depicting the success of the people here, because they're in I think ours mostly are into the fourth world, which is also where the Choctaws are now, fourth world.
Multi-universe kind of.
Yeah.
Ideas. I'm interested in religious anthropology. Are there people that still kind of like follow these religious ideas?
With the Spanish influence and the effort to assimilate the native people to the culture, unfortunately, we do see a lot of the information that might have been known is gone. But it's that's not to say that the petroglyphs still aren't a very important part of the spiritual and traditional life of the native people. And of course, we should then be respectful of that. In design work, for example, we would want to respect the intellectual property that belongs to our native people here. So yeah, it's still a very strong traditional thing for people to go to the petroglyph sites and bring an offering and things like that to remember the ancient people.
So the fine, I think, is pretty stiff if you're caught damaging one of these sites. And the problem is, I don't know how often it happens where someone's not intoxicated when they do it.
And luckily, here in Arizona, we have a program, a volunteer program with the State Historic Preservation Office, and they're called the Site Stewards of Arizona. And they're volunteers. I'm a member of the Site Steward organization. And we just go out and monitor prehistoric as well as historic sites. We have a lot of ghost towns and stuff in Arizona, just to check on whether anybody's been vandalizing or trying to remove petroglyphs to take home and things like that. So through that program itself, we've actually had a couple of very successful prosecutions here of people either pot hunting, for example, or defacing or removing the petroglyphs. And you're right, it is a pretty stiff fine. I think it's upwards of $5,000.
Well, thank you for your help with that.
Oh, I enjoy that.
Is the right answer to cut it and put it in a museum? It's safe, but does it mean the same thing when you see it in a wall behind glass versus, a bird flying above and the snake in the grass?
I couldn't agree with you more. In some of the housing developments up in the North Country, they found boulders of petroglyphs in this housing development they were going to build. And so they got a hold of that's mostly Yaqui area up there. And they got a hold of the elders and some of the medicine people, and they removed those petroglyphs out of the way of the bulldozers and things like that. And then when the development was done, they placed them as close as they could back into that situation in the same directions and everything, again, honoring the past of the people that are.
That's not how I thought the story was going to go.
Well, and again, we do see evidence where in the past people have actually tried to cut the petroglyphs out of the rocks and things. For the most part, our granite here is called rotten granite because it's not tightly compressed like you would put on the steps to the courthouse or something like that. So in most cases, they probably just crumbled. So we lost that image due to that vandalism, I'll say, even though realizing that people were somewhat honoring those glyphs because they did want to have them.
Your background in, I think, botany, right? You were a plant scientist. So, David, if we took you and any part of the desert, just left you there, could you survive?
It'd be a tough road to hoe. The climate, of course, has changed here. and it was much milder back in the days around the AD/BC split. There was probably more rain, a little milder climate than there is even today. Groundwater was much closer to the surface, sometimes within 20 feet. Groundwater here in the area I live in is about 200 feet now, due to all the farming activities and things like that. It's kind of sad that we've had to go to those extremes to exist here. But, I really love Arizona, so I'm glad that they did that in the long sense. Plant for plant, the desert has as many useful plants as the rainforest has. But, of course, there's a limited number of plants in the desert as opposed to the rainforest. So, there are a lot of food plants here. Cactus fruit was the vitamin C source for our native people, because grapefruits and oranges and lemons came with the European explorers after the 1500s. We have some varieties of Brussels sprouts and things like that that are native to this area, which are also are vitamin C sources. You can eat prickly pear pads. That's a big treat. If you go someplace and ask for nopal or nopalitos, you're going to get the prickly pear pad actually sliced up and given to you. Very, very nutritious. And if you don't like okra, you're not going to like prickly pear, though, because it's really slimy. It's sliced down about the same way. But prickly pear is the aloe vera of the desert. So also has a medicinal value then. So unlike the aloes, which again don't belong here in America, they came from Africa and Madagascar, brought in by the explorers, and we're happy they're here. But our aloe vera was the prickly pear cactus, which has the same components as the aloe plant. Mesquite beans, big source of fiber and calcium source for our native people here. So it would have been tough, and that's why in the early days there were hunter-gatherers, because they also had to supplement some of that plant material with meat items. Of course, you need that high protein in a lot of cases anyway. But as they transitioned into more of an agricultural society, then these native food plants, natural food plants, became less important, which is kind of unfortunate, because that probably also affected the metabolism of the native people here. And not to bring a sour note to the screen here, but sugar problems, high blood sugar is rampant in our native communities here. And it probably due to the adoption of the dominant culture meals. So we say, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings here, but it kind of all started when they began to eat the white foods, sugar, wheat flour, which we also didn't have at Spanish introduction, lard or Crisco, milk, which we didn't have to begin with. So when all those things came into the metabolism, our native people, we see just a spike, just like almost like somebody flipped a light switch. High blood sugar rampant on our Indian communities here.
In my community, we need hunters because we have such a surplus of deer.
When I first began teaching, and of course, you never want to throw yourself into another culture, because you need to be accepted, and you don't want to push yourself onto other people. But the way I knew that they were accepting me was when Saturday morning there was a knock on my door. It was a bunch of the Tonatam workers at the school there saying, "Come on, Dave, we're going hunting." And so that's when I knew I was kind of in. So again, that's as I say, traditional, to a certain respect, spiritual, because of course you want to thank the Creator and thank that animal spirit for giving you that substance that you might need. But yeah, the hunting is not as prevalent as it used to be. Bighorns, again, we see a lot of symbols, but they are also more of a spiritual symbol. They're in the high Rocky Mountains, in inaccessible places. And so to go hunting for them would have been a very arduous task. But to get one, boy, that would have been food for the village, probably for a whole winter time.
was watching a TV program you were on, and you were telling the hikers that if you're lucky, we'll see a rattlesnake. Well, my wife almost stepped on 2 rattlesnakes. So you get bit. What do you do?
Of course, the first thing is don't panic, which is hard not to do. We have probably a couple of hundred rattlesnake bites here in Arizona every year, but I don't think there's been a recorded death in the last 5 or 6 years from rattlesnakes. So we have some antivenom, of course, and there are other products now available to help counteract the effect. So a healthy person, even with no treatment, probably is not going to die from a rattlesnake bite. There's going to be some, tissue damage and things like that. But a very young person who has a lower blood ratio to the poison that's introduced, or older infirm people would be the more likely candidates to succumb to a rattlesnake bite. So yeah, just get to medical attention. Don't cut an X in it. Try to suck the poison out, or tight compress or tourniquet. Stay calm and get to a medical person as fast as you can, and you're probably going to be okay. I do a lot of tours with 4th graders when I worked at one of the local museums here, and I always tell them the story about the 2 rattlesnakes that were crawling through the desert. And one of the rattlesnakes said, "Are we poisonous snakes?" And the other rattlesnake said, "Yeah, why?" And the first rattlesnake says, "I just bit my tongue." It's
was there some kind of a treatment that the tribal people would use?
There were several herbs that were used. A plant called snake root, which is Aristolochii watsoni, was used. Let's see what else. There's a rattlesnake weed, which is a member of the Euphorbia or spurge family. So you would make a poultice and put that on the wound, and then probably drink some tea of the same plant to help counteract the effects. Whether they actually did too much good, we're not sure. They're both pretty harsh emetics, so it might have been that that cure took your mind off of the bite itself. A little, the cure is worse than the disease. So also, it plays a part in the consciousness of a person. You think you're going to get better, and oftentimes you do.
Placebo effect. In Jewish narratives, this ties into the snake bite. The snake bites someone, and I don't know if you know the story or not, but Moses is commanded to carve a bronze serpent, and the people look at it, and when they look at it, they're healed. It's a kind of a totem spirit kind of thing of like, by capturing the graven image, by capturing, that's one of the theories why Yahweh does not want his image carved, because then you can control it. And this is in a lot of different religions.
Okay, sure.
So if you carve his image, you're going to be able to control him. If you carve the serpent and the people get bit, they look at the serpent and they're healed. Do you see any of that in these carvings, where it's like the idea is to control the animals, or is that more of a mythical interpretation?
We do see the rattlesnake design, and we believe it was a place maybe they would come to heal from that. Maybe that's where the medicine person would have taken that person and used the power of that animal. Traditionally here, we don't tell stories in the summertime, because the rattlesnakes and the lizards all have power. And if they hear a story, then they have the power to change things in that story. And so the next day, it might not be exactly the same world that you woke up in the day before. We do see some petroglyphs of horned lizards, horned toads. There's a horned toad sickness that the people succumb to here sometimes. Actually, it's more of one of those kinds of things that you're not being a human being. You're not treating people well. You're putting yourself above people. And so they say if you cross the path of a horned toad, then he will kind of inflict an illness on you. The little Hopi carvings, for example, to help cure that individual spiritually of bites or things like that. Okay.
I'd love for you to talk about your journey of becoming an artist, and just talk about your process.
I came to Arizona from Oklahoma right after high school. So this is pretty much home. I've been here for quite a while now. I'm almost 70. So I've spent most of my time here in the desert. After college, my first real job was as a science teacher. I taught science and math to the middle school kids here in the Tohono Indian community, down around Tucson, and then in the Acamel, the river people communities. And that's where a lot of the information that I kind of pass on came from. People were comfortable enough with me, tell me some of the traditions that went along with the plants and the petroglyph carvings and things. Really an honor for me to get that. The more and more I saw of the petroglyphs here, the more and more I wanted one. And of course, again, as we talked about, it's highly illegal to remove them from the desert. So I decided the only way I was going to get a petroglyph was if I made one myself. And so I actually started carving. I still use traditional methods. It's called a percussion technique. They're going to use a hammer stone and just directly against the stone, and they're going to chip away that desert varnish. The lighter color of the rock shows through, and that's how your design stands out. Mm-hmm. So you're actually, it's called pecking. It's kind of like a bird pecking the ground, I guess. So you're actually kind of just crushing that desert varnish, which is a really thin coating on there. So this is one of the hammer stones that I've used for 20 years to do my carving. This little point right here actually was about 1/4 of an inch longer, but I've worn it down so much. And then if you need a finer line or a more intricate symbol, you're going to go to what they call an indirect percussion. So I have a little stone chisel or an anvil, the archaeologists call it. And then I'm going to use this just like a hammer and chisel a modern artist would use to do the same carving. But boy, I've got a lot more control over where my line's going to go and where I'm going to chip off that varnish here. So again, the point's worn down, but also you can see, I think maybe this indentation here. Mm-hmm. That's from 20 years of indirect percussion with this hammer stone. And I've worn that hole down inside of this. That's where my chisel would fit. Wow. You know, things progressed. I did it again because I wanted one. Again, really enamored and respectful of the art tradition here at the petroglyphs. My very first showing in one of the Indian marks here was at the Heard Museum, which is a pretty reputable museum here. And I applied. It's hard to get into the show. I was surprised I even got in. And I bought about 20 or 30 different carvings that I had done. The market opened at 9, and at 10 o'clock, I was staring at an empty table. And I told my partner at that time, I said, you know, I think I stumbled onto something here.
Wonderful.
So I just continued my work. I love going out, looking for the petroglyphs, seeing new designs. People send me pictures of some of the designs. And again, I will say that I generally try not to do exact duplicates because they are a part of the spiritual makeup of the people here. But I can do a symbol that represents that or you know, is very similar to that design. And the way I do that, sometimes I'll just look at the picture or the rock art, and then on the way back to my vehicle, I'll do a drawing of what I remember. So it's not exactly the same. So that way, there's a little bit of the ancient people there and a little bit of me.
That's fair.
The designs. The other art form I got are gourds. Gourds are an important plant for our people here because, again, prehistorically, they're looking for, you know, a gourd growth. They consider it to be the oldest domesticated plant, or gourds. And so in the days that predate pottery production, people are looking for something to keep things in. Yeah. So the gourd became the prehistoric Tupperware, if you want to look at it that way.
That's great.
And again, as I mentioned, just because an object is useful doesn't mean it shouldn't also shine with beauty. And so the gourds that I do are based on the prehistoric designs, pottery and basket designs of the people here in the Southwest, which I've discovered are somewhat less spiritual, I guess would be the word, so are a little more easy to use without you know, damaging that intellectual property of the people here. One of the reasons I went into gourds is because as I'm getting older, I'm looking for something a little bit lighter to carry around to these shows, because I'm the only one I know that carries a truckload of basalt stones across Arizona.
Yeah. So if people wanted to connect with your artwork, and or take one of your plant identification tours. Are you primarily connected with some of the museums you've been with in the past, or should people connect more through your website?
Through the website now.
Okay.
On the webpage, there is a calendar of events that shows where I may be speaking or offering a nature walk or something. And it also will list any of the Indian art markets that I'm going to be attending here in the area. I don't stray too far from Arizona, New Mexico sometimes, and things like that. But that's about the best way to keep track. Pueblo Grande Museum here in Phoenix, where I spent about almost 20 years working, carries some of my gourd and rock art pieces. So they're a chance, if you're in the Phoenix area, to check that out as well.
As we close up, maybe share a couple plants that you find quite fascinating that have healing properties or that are quite special to the area.
Oh, sure. Well, of course, the number one on the hit parade here is our creosote bush. And the creosote is found in all 4 of the American deserts, but it's so prolific here. It's a very aromatic plant because the leaf system has a lot of oils in it that help protect it from drying out and from ultraviolet damage here in our intense sunlight. And those oils, some are volatile, so when it rains, that scent is released into the atmosphere, just like if you muddle some mint, you get to smell that. And that's a nice clean smell that everybody says, oh, it smells like rain, because that's what our creosote bush contributes here. Somebody thought that smelled like creosote, which is the wood preservative they use on fence posts and railroad ties and stuff like that. But name-wise, that's the only connection. You can't get creosote out of a creosote bush. It just smells like that. The Spanish name actually translates to little stinker because, again, it is so aromatic and everything. But, man, it's the drugstore of the desert for our native people here. Usually made into a tea, can be used internally or topically. Boy, it's good for cuts and burns, bruises, scratches, corns, bunions, rheumatism, arthritis, muscular aches and pains, high or low blood pressure, heart disease, fallen arches, or housemaid's knee. And you can get some bottles on my, no, you can't get yeah. But it is a very important plant to our, the tradition says that was the very first plant that the creator placed in the desert when he finished the landscape, basically. So a very revered plant, medicinal plant. With all those oils, though, I have to admit it tastes really bad. Okay, there's about 300 different chemicals making up those oils. And so they say if you can stand to drink creosote tea, there's probably something else wrong with you other than whatever you're trying to cure. So it's kind of an acquired taste. A good germ killer for cuts and scrapes. There's some evidence that it may be good in precancers, lesions and things like that. So still a lot of research to be done, but traditionally it's the go-to plant for stomach aches and things like that here in the desert.
David Morris, thank you so much for your time. So much fun to talk about petroglyphs and your artwork. I'll put links in the bottom for people to be able to stay connected with you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Petroglyphs, some of the most interesting and mysterious artifacts of the Hohokam civilization. We went along on a morning petroglyph hike in Phoenix's South Mountain Park.
Petroglyphs along the way, and of course we'll probably stop and do a little plant talk too, since by training I'm a botanist. Okay, so I got to throw a little bit of plant stuff in there for you. If you happen to see a piece of artifact on the ground, a shard or sherd of pottery, for example, you know, everything here in the South Mountain Preserve is protected. So that includes plants, the animals, the rocks, and all the archaeology that's here. Nobody really knows for sure what these designs mean. So there is a lot of conjecture and some consensus as to what the designs mean. So I'm giving you the benefit of what I've learned from the archaeologists and anthropologists, but also I'm going to combine that with some of my Native American background, some of the people I've talked to on the reservations here, the medicine people, and putting that together, giving you my explanation. No better than anybody else's, but probably no worse than anybody else's either. Nice little grouping here in this little wash system. A lot of the human figures that you'll see here, an excellent deer carving. To the left there you'll see what we call an outline cross. It's a big cross box with a cross on the inside. And a lot of people are suspecting that that's representing the morning star. That's real reminiscent of a lot of pottery and basket designs. So maybe this is a way to preserve some of those designs. Other people have suggested that perhaps they're talking about trails or field layouts. There's a little bit of our Indian tobacco right at the base of this rock surface here. So that was one of the plants that was used ceremoniously. So that brings us to another thing that perhaps we passed a lot of rock surfaces that looked really good. Now, why didn't they do any carvings there? But here they've done carvings. Well, we think there were probably ceremonial reasons to do rock art at a certain spot. Perhaps this was where the power was felt, or whatever the criteria was. A native person is collecting tobacco to use in like a sweat or a pipe ceremony. They'll use Indian tobacco or the tree tobacco, which is it's the ancestor of our modern tobacco. That's actually where the tobacco came from. And this is Nicotiana trigonophylla, or maybe you learned it as Nicotiana trigonophylla, because it names the alkaloid in there, nicotine. Mm-hmm. And I have smoked this, but I did not inhale.
He says Hohokam and other Indian peoples use the tiny bits of quartz around the ant holes to make gourd rattles.
So to make it rattle, you got to clean everything out, and then you come down here to the ant hills and you look for these little round pieces of quartz that the ants have brought up out of the earth. And those are gifts to the Indian people to put in the rattle to make them rattle. But of course, when you collect that, you always want to bring a little piece of cookie or candy, because you want to keep the trade. You want to keep the trade going between the ant people. In the Hopi tradition, they're again saying that we're in like the fourth world. And so in one of the recreations of the world, the creator asked the ant people to take the Indian people that believed in the true ways down into their world and keep them safe down there until it was time to come out on the new earth surface. So the ants took the Indian people down in there, kept them very safe, but they began to run out of food. So the ants gave all the food to the Indian people, didn't eat anything themselves, saved the Indian people. But the ants got hungrier and hungrier, so they kept tightening their belts tighter and tighter, and that's why the ant has a little bitty narrow waist today. Okay, so we really revere the ants and try not to step on them, teach you to be industrious and everything. So kind of neat little animals. They'll harvest saguaro seeds. In some areas, 90% of the saguaro seeds that are produced will be harvested by these guys.
We cross over a ridge peppered with cholla and into Pima Canyon,
indicating an emergence point. So the spiral may be showing the emergence points or vortex. Mm-hmm. Sedona's got nothing on us. Okay, we got plenty of stuff here. But that's a real reminiscent of a lot of the pottery designs that we'll see done in Hohokam styles pottery. There's also kind of towards this end, almost looks like eyes looking at you. And they call it the bear mask. And so maybe a representation of the bear. Of course, in the valley, we know there are bears around. Yeah. And this year has been pretty good for bears. Mm-hmm. Been kind of grisly. Some of these were for ceremonial or ritual value. Who are you drawing them for? Mm-hmm. And if you're drawing them for the creator, you want them up higher where you can see them better. So a lot of possible explanations. But these are the ones they call the dancers. And for sure, anthropomorphic figures, that's what the anthropologists call human-like figures. And they look like they are dancing, in fact. So we believe they maybe are dancing for, because of a good harvest, number one, or in order to obtain a good harvest. So maybe for rain, they're doing a dance, because there was a dance done here in the Southwest as a rain dance. This is one of the biggest human figures or anthropomorphic figures that we see in the canyon here in South Mountain. And that guy's probably about 4 foot tall or so. And of course you have to pick them out through all the graffiti that's over there now. And this area has kind of been posted as off limits now because of the people scurrying over the boulders and adding their graffiti to that too. So that's kind of a sad addition to the park here. But it's nice to be able to still pick out that large figure. And there are a few other figures around that little mountain outcropping, which is another point we probably should make, that when you do hike here in South Mountain, you want to be aware of the signs and where the trail is posted. To stay on the trail, you need to do that, and that helps preserve the vegetation, and so the park will be here for everybody to enjoy in the future. And so for botanists, it gets tough. When you use common names all the time, it gets confusing. I can say Palo Verde, and somebody's looking at the blue Palo Verde, somebody else is looking at the little leaf Palo Verde. Which Palo Verde are we talking about? And of course, you also know, right, Palo Verde is a state tree of Arizona. legume or bean family. So the beans were used as food, as were the Palo Verde seeds and of course the mesquite beans, which were the famous food, the staple of the people here in the early days. They look very similar, so it's hard to tell them apart often. But again, Palo Verdes now we know have green bark, right? So that's a good way to tell them apart. Ironwood typically has a nice gray bark. So you look for that smooth gray bark, tells you it's ironwood. And when you see a mesquite tree, you'll see a brown shaggy bark on the mesquite. A cubic foot of ironwood weighs 66 pounds. You throw that into water, it sinks. So don't make a raft out of this, all right? Not going to get you very far. But it would make a good tool handle, right? So our Hohokam people and the early Pima and other native people that were here used it as tool handle, very hard wood. And they even used it for arrowheads because it's hard enough to actually hold an edge. So not a lot of chert, flint, obsidian here. So ironwood is hard enough to hold an edge for an arrow point. So most of our desert trees grow real slow because that's the survival factor here. You slow down your metabolism so that you can deal with the heat and the drought conditions here. We got that little rain, just about 3 or 4 days ago, so they're really fast at collecting the water that comes down. So it's pushed out some nice leaves for us to look at here. And you'll notice that some of the very upper branches do have a green tinge to them. So like a lot of our other plants, they do a little bit of that bark photosynthesis, which is why the Palo Verde is green, because it's doing a lot of the photosynthesis through the green bark system. So a lot of our plants, ocotillos and things, will have portions that are green in the bark area that are also doing some of the photosynthesis for the plant. Drought deciduous is one of the survivals here to survive. When it gets real hard going, then leaves will be dropped to conserve water, because that's where most of the water is lost from a plant. It's out of the leaf system. You drop all your leaves, then you don't lose any water. But of course, leaves are there for photosynthesis. So how are you going to make your food? Well, if you have some green stuff, some chlorophyll for photosynthesis in your bark system, you can still make enough food to get through the hot, dry summer months. So they call it drought deciduous. Good survival tactic. A lot of plants do that here.